Great. So if we want to create a sketch using P5JS, there's two ways that we can do this. The first is to go to editor.p5js.org, which you're seeing here. This is the online P5JS editor. You can write code, run it right in the browser, all that stuff. It's really cool. It also, you can save it, you can share it with other people so they can run it, they can duplicate your sketch and modify it and make their own version. And there's some things that are really awesome about this, but for our purposes today, we're actually not going to use that editor. I'm going to work in the processing IDE, so we can not only write Java sketches in here, but we can actually write P5JS sketches as well. And the reasons I prefer using the processing editor are, there's maybe a couple. One is just, I don't know, I'm kind of old school. I like using this editor and kind of having it on my computer. I don't know, there's something about it that just feels good, all the keyboard shortcuts, all that kind of stuff. The other reason, though, is that the P5JS web editor requires you to be online. So you have to have an internet connection to be able to use it. And if you're traveling or you want to sit outside in the park or something and work on a sketch, it makes it harder to do that. And so I kind of like this offline mode. You can work whichever way you want. Both of these are totally going to work just fine. The one thing that we need to do to switch the editor to be run in P5JS is to change the mode. So we can see here our mode currently says Java, and we want to switch this to P5JS. If that doesn't show up, you can click on this Add Mode button here, and this little window pops up, and you can pick these different modes. There's also a Python mode, an Android mode, some other stuff. You can install that, and then you should see it as an option. So I'm going to select P5JS here. And you'll notice it creates this kind of basic structure for us. And we're going to talk a little bit about, in a minute, some of the differences between how the Java mode and the P5JS mode work. There's just a couple of things. Almost everything really translates pretty seamlessly. So we've got our function, our setup and our draw functions here. And actually the first difference is in processing, we would set the size of our sketch using the size command. But in P5JS, we say create canvas. And then it works the same way. We give it two numbers that are the width and the height. And we're not going to get into a ton of details about JavaScript in general. That's kind of out of scope here. But you'll notice a lot of stuff looks basically the same. Even though the word Java is in the word JavaScript, they're actually not related in any way, but a lot of stuff is very similar. So you'll notice we need semicolons at the end of a line, curly brackets, that kind of structure is very common. So we've created the size of our canvas. Let's also, so that we can see something, I'm going to use the background command. And background, fill, stroke, we'll see are all very similar to the Java mode. And then to run this, I think it's a good idea to save it first. So I'm going to save this as demo. Already exists. That's okay. I'm going to write over that. And then when you click the run button, instead of popping up its own little window, it opens up the web browser, whichever one is your default. And this will work in any browser, whichever one you're comfortable and happy with. And here's our sketch right here, our little 400 by 400 window. If you're wondering what these crazy numbers are, what's actually happening behind the scenes is that P5JS is creating a little web server that then is able to communicate between your browser and the processing IDE. So you're able to make changes, and it's kind of essentially like a little internet, but locally on your computer. So now we can do things like change this here. Now, if you click the run button again, it's going to open it in a new tab, which is fine, but maybe is going to get kind of frustrating as you're making changes. But instead, you should be able to make a change over here if you saved your sketch. Save it, and then in your browser, you can just hit refresh. And in most browsers, that's going to be Command or Control R. So it's going to be helpful, I think, to get in the habit of those keyboard shortcuts. And now you can see the changes both in the size and the background color have taken effect, which is really cool. So let's take a look at a couple other basic drawing commands, and then we'll talk about some of the other things that are a little different. Things like fill are going to be the same. So black fill, no stroke, that's going to be the same. Most of the drawing commands are all the same, like ellipse. And in fact, even we can access the width and the height in the same way, which is also really great. And so again, I'm going to save this. I'm going to go over to my browser and hit refresh, and we should see it pop up. So I said before, there's a couple things that are a little bit different in JavaScript than in the Java mode. And the first one has to do with variables. So in traditional processing, we would say something like x equals 0 or string this. And that's because Java, so this is Java, is a typed language. And what that means is that you have to specify what type of variable something is. You have to be very specific. Is this not just a number, but what kind of number? Is this a string or a Boolean variable or something like that? JavaScript, however, is not typed. And this means that we can be more vague, and JavaScript is able to kind of figure out what type of variable something is. And in fact, later we can change the type of a variable as well if we want to. Now, you're going to see in examples you find online that there's actually two ways that people create variables. One is using the var keyword. So this is telling JavaScript that this is a variable. So we can say var x equals 0 or var name equals Jeff. Or you may see people using let. Both of these basically do the same thing. You can go online and find lots of articles explaining the details of this. It's really confusing, and even to somebody who's been doing JavaScript for a long time, understanding what really the difference is very hard to understand. So for our purposes, let's just assume they're exactly the same. They're not, but they're, for what we're doing, it's not a big deal. So if we wanted to create a variable, let's say one called x and one called y for a position of this circle, we can use var x equals, let's say 100, var y equals 100, like this. And then down here in our ellipse, we can use, just like in processing, x and y. I'm going to save this. And when I run this, we should now see our circle at 100 by 100. If we were to change this and run it again, you can see it's moved around. So that's one of the major changes, or the differences to kind of keep track of. In some ways, this is easier because we don't have to be specific about what type of variable something is. The other place that we're going to run into this is in for loops. So normally we would say in processing, we would say int I equals 0, I is less than some value, something like this. But because JavaScript is untyped, we don't want to say int here. We can just change that to var. So I equals 0, I is less than 100. That is all going to be the same. And then let's actually delete this up here, and we can create a bunch of random ellipses. So I'm going to create a variable called x, and we can use the random function again, just the same as before. So I can say between 0 and width, and let's make one called y, between 0 and height. Now, if you've forgotten the syntax of something in P5JS, or if you're trying to see how it's different than in regular processing, a really great place to look is at the P5JS reference. And this is at p5js.org/reference, or if you go to the main page, you'll find it there. And this is a lot like the regular processing reference. You can scroll through and find different things. And so if I'm looking for random here, I can search for that, I can find it, and then I can actually see these examples in the same way, which is really great. And so in this case, the random function works exactly the same, which is really cool. And then I can draw an ellipse at x and y. Let's do these 10 by 10. And I'm going to set my fill color as well. Let's do white, no stroke. And now I'm going to save this and run it. And we should see crazy tons of these little circles. because just like in regular processing, the draw loop is running over and over and over as fast as it can, which is going to let us do things like create animations and interactivity and stuff like that we'll see in a little bit. One of the cool things, this is kind of an aside, but one of the cool things that's a little different is we can actually specify semi-transparent backgrounds. So I can make this kind of a middle gray, but give it a really low opacity, and now we should see these sort of trails from these random shapes showing up, which is pretty cool. So there's one other thing to highlight that's different. So we talked about create canvas as opposed to the size command, and we talked about variables and that they don't have a type. There's one other thing that may be helpful right now to think about, and that's going to be how you create functions. And so again, in the past, in the Java mode, we do things like void display or int multiply, something like that. And again, keeping in mind, the reason we have to have this here is that void and int are variable types, int being a number, void meaning no value. But instead, in the JavaScript mode, we say function because we don't need to give it a specific type. So I can say function multiply. Oops, got to spell that right. Multiply. But then otherwise, the syntax is the same. We can put in arguments here. Let's say we have x and y, and we want to multiply two numbers together. And you'll notice this is outside of the setup and the draw here, just like any other function. And I can say var result equals x times y, return result. And then we could use this up here. So I could, just let's say in my setup, I want to say var m equals multiply, oh, I don't know, 33 times 128. Now, if we want to see the result of this number, there's a few ways we could do it. We could have it display on the screen. The print line command that we're used to using in the Java mode is not going to work here. Instead, we need to say console.log. And I'll show you in a second how we get to the console to see this, but we can put a variable in there. We can put in text, anything like that. Now, if I save this and run it, hopefully we shouldn't see any errors. That's great. Now, to be able to see the console, the part that's printing, in the web editor, it's built in right here. So we can just see it all at once, which is great. But you also notice that it's kind of squeezed in here. So we've got the editor and the console and our sketch all in the same place. It's another reason I like using the offline editor. Now, this is going to vary depending on what browser you're using. But if you go to Tools, I'm in Firefox. If you go to Tools, Web Developer, and Console here, or I'm just going to go ahead and toggle the tools. This is another shortcut that's helpful. And then choose Console. And now I can see the result over here. It's printed out 4224. Maybe we want to make this a little nicer, so we can say multiply result. And we can do this just like in Java, which is really cool. And now I can see it as printed over here with this label. So console.log, just like printline, is going to be really useful as you're debugging, and especially as you're getting started using P5JS. If you've not written JavaScript before, it's going to be really helpful to have some of that stuff, printing out, just so you can kind of do a sanity check. So let's make one other function here, and then I'm going to move this this drawing function off into its own spot, this little for loop. So I'm going to say function, lots of dots. We don't need any arguments here, though we could create those. Maybe we want to change that in a sec. And in this case, this would be a return void or no value in the Java mode. But here we can just call lots of dots like this. Again, save it, refresh the browser, and we should see it running just as usual, which is really cool. Let's make one change. Let's have it, maybe we want to add the number of iterations. And so we can say how many circles to draw. Pass that as an argument. And then in here, we can give it a number. So we could say 100 to be like before, 10, we can try that. save it, refresh over here. You can see fewer dots. You can bump that up to be 500. At some point, it's going to sort of freak out and choke, but this is pretty great. And actually, the other thing you'll see is that the JavaScript mode runs really great. We're not seeing a lot of lag or like slowing down. Your browser is really well optimized for this kind of stuff. And so it's going to run really great even with live video, as we'll see later. So that's the basics of kind of a basic sketch in P5JS. You can see you don't have to do a lot of different things to kind of transition from the Java mode to be able to do really cool stuff.